The morning sky over Arlington National Cemetery was calm, painted with a soft shade of gray. The early sun hid behind thin clouds, casting a cool light across the long rows of white marble stones. Each stone stood quietly, perfectly aligned, each carrying a name or sometimes no name at all. This place was not like any other. It was sacred, a field of memories and sacrifice. At the center of that sacred ground stood the tomb of the unknown soldier. For more than 100 years, soldiers had stood guard there, 24 hours a day without pause. Rain, snow, or burning summer heat, nothing stopped them. Their march was endless, their promise eternal. That morning, Sergeant Daniel Hayes began his shift like he had done countless times before. Dressed sharply in his dark blue uniform, buttons shining like small stars, he prepared himself for duty. His shoes were so polished that the marble floor could be seen reflected in them. Every part of his clothing had to be perfect. Every movement had to be measured and exact. Daniel wasn't just any soldier. He was a member of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment known as the Old Guard. They were trusted with one of the highest honors in the military, to guard the tomb. Not everyone could do it. Many trained, few succeeded. Before his shift began, Daniel stood in a small room behind the memorial. He checked his rifle again, although he already knew it was spotless. He adjusted the brim of his hat and straightened his belt. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see himself. He saw his duty. He whispered quietly, "Honor them well," just as he did before every shift. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. Tourists were already gathering around the low chain that marked the boundary of the sacred area. Families stood silently, some holding hands, others taking photos. There was a soft murmur in the crowd, but when the ceremony started, all sound seemed to fade away. The relief commander appeared first, marching with steady rhythm. Daniel followed behind him, every step measured to the exact inch. The guard who had been on duty ended his watch, and Daniel took his place. The two men faced each other in perfect balance, eyes locked in mutual respect. Then, with a crisp salute, Daniel began his walk along the black mat in front of the tomb. 21 steps forward. Stop. Turn to face the tomb for 21 seconds. Turn again. 21 steps back. Repeat. Each movement carried deep meaning. The number 21 represented the highest military honor, the 21-gun salute. Every moment Daniel spent walking was a living salute to those who could not return home. As he marched, the world around him disappeared. The whispers of the tourists, the sound of the wind through the trees, even the distant city noise, all faded. Only the sound of his boots against the marble floor remained. Daniel had learned to block everything out. Years of training had taught him focus, patience, and silence. Once, during a lightning storm, he had stood his post without flinching. Once, during heavy snow, he had marched through the night with ice gathering on his shoulders. It wasn't pride that kept him there. It was respect. He often thought about the soldiers buried beneath the white marble. No names, no faces, no stories known to the world, only the knowledge that they had given everything for their country. And now, he guarded them, not because he was ordered to, but because he wanted to. Every day, tourists came to see the tomb. Some came with deep emotion, some with curiosity, some just to take pictures. Daniel never looked at them directly. His eyes stayed forward, always focused. Yet he noticed everything: the quiet tears of an elderly woman, the respectful nod of a veteran, or the small child who saluted clumsily but sincerely. Those small moments made his long hours worthwhile. On that particular morning, something felt slightly different. The air was a bit colder than usual, and a soft breeze moved through the trees. The sky darkened slightly, though no rain had been forecast. Daniel didn't care. His pace remained steady, his steps perfect. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a small group of young men approaching the chain. They were talking loudly and laughing, not out of malice, but out of ignorance. He had seen people like that before, those who didn't understand the weight of this place. One of them pointed at him and said something Daniel couldn't hear. Another raised his phone to record. Daniel didn't react. He had been trained not to. Still, he kept his awareness sharp. The tomb was sacred ground. No one was allowed to cross that barrier. Minutes passed and the crowd continued watching respectfully. except for those two young men. They seemed amused by the silence and discipline. They whispered, smirked, and made gestures as if trying to see if the guard would break character. Daniel didn't move an inch. His face remained calm, his expression neutral. But deep inside he felt a quiet disappointment, not anger, but sadness that someone could come here and not feel the weight of what it meant. A mother in the crowd tried to hush the young men, but they ignored her. Then one of them took a step closer to the chain, pretending to take a better photo. He leaned forward, balancing on the edge. That was enough. Daniel's voice, clear and firm, broke the silence. "Remain behind the chain, please." His tone was not harsh, but it carried authority. The young man froze for a moment, then smiled awkwardly. His friend whispered something, and they both laughed. Daniel resumed his walk. The rest of the crowd remained silent, watching with respect. Some shook their heads, others whispered to each other about how embarrassing it was, but Daniel didn't let it disturb him. His duty was not to react, it was to remain steady, unshaken, as every tomb guard before him had done. After some minutes, a group of students arrived, led by a teacher who spoke softly about the history of the tomb. She explained how each guard went through months of training, memorizing every fact about the memorial, every detail of the soldiers buried there. She spoke about the symbolism of every step, the respect behind every movement. Daniel could not show emotion, but inside he felt gratitude. It meant something when people took the time to understand. As the morning went on, the crowd changed. Some left quietly, others arrived with curiosity. Daniel's focus never broke. Even when the wind picked up and a faint drizzle began to fall, he kept his steady rhythm. Tourists pulled up their hoods. Umbrellas opened, but Daniel stayed exactly where he was, marching with the same precision as before. To him, weather didn't matter. The tomb deserved the same respect in sunshine or rain. After almost an hour, a small girl near the front asked her father, "Why doesn't he talk?" Her father whispered, "Because he's guarding someone who can't talk anymore." The child nodded slowly, understanding in her own small way. That simple exchange stayed in Daniel's mind as he continued his watch. He knew many people might forget what they saw here by the next day, but some, like that little girl, would remember. Maybe they would tell others. Maybe they would understand why silence could be more powerful than words. When the relief commander finally approached to prepare for the next change, Daniel felt the quiet satisfaction of a soldier who had done his duty well. The ceremony was repeated with the same precision, every salute sharp, every motion exact. As he stepped off the mat and returned to the preparation room, he removed his gloves carefully. He didn't smile, but there was a calm pride in his heart. Outside, the drizzle had stopped and the sun began to break through the clouds. The white marble gleamed again, bright and peaceful. Daniel looked back once before closing the door. The tomb stood silent, guarded and respected, just as it had been for generations. For him, that silence was not empty. It was filled with the voices of those who had given everything, and he was honored to be the one who stood watch over their rest. The next morning began with the same peaceful silence that always filled Arlington Cemetery. The air was cool, and a light mist floated between the white headstones. Everything was calm, still, and respectful. Yet for Sergeant Daniel Hayes, that peace would soon be tested in a way he had never imagined. He arrived early, as always. The world outside the cemetery was busy, cars honking, people rushing, but here, time seemed to move slower. Every sound that entered this place became softer, as if even noise respected the dead. Daniel prepared himself for duty with careful hands. He brushed his uniform, checked his gloves, and polished his shoes one last time. His rifle stood beside him, shining as if it had never seen a speck of dust. Every movement he made was slow and deliberate. There was never any hurry here, only precision. Before stepping out, he took one deep breath. He often did that before walking to the mat. It helped him center his thoughts and leave the world behind. As he walked out toward the tomb, tourists had already begun to gather. Some were families visiting for the first time. Others were veterans standing silently with hats in their hands. A few stood with tears in their eyes, whispering to each other about loved ones lost long ago. Daniel took his position, his boots clicking softly against the stone. The changing ceremony took place just like it did every hour, and then he began his steady, graceful march. 21 steps forward. Stop. Turn. 21 seconds of stillness. Turn again, repeat. Everything was perfect. Everything was quiet. But sometimes, even in a place built on respect, the world sends small tests. Among the visitors, 2 young men arrived, laughing loudly. They were in their 20s, dressed casually, one carrying a large camera, the other scrolling on his phone. They seemed amused by everything around them, as if they didn't understand where they were standing. At first, their laughter felt harmless. Many people came here without truly understanding the rules or the sacredness of the tomb. Daniel noticed them only in the corner of his eye, keeping his focus on his walk. Guards were trained to stay calm. Distractions were part of the challenge. The young men watched Daniel for a while. One whispered something to the other, and they both chuckled. Then they started talking loudly, their voices echoing slightly in the quiet air. A few visitors turned to look, frowning. Still, Daniel continued his routine. Minutes passed. The young men grew bolder. One of them began imitating Daniel's steps in a playful way, as if trying to mock him. The other held up his phone, recording and laughing quietly. They found humor in what they didn't understand. Daniel didn't move. His eyes stayed forward. His duty was to protect the tomb, not to react emotionally. He had been trained to maintain control even in the most disrespectful situations. But then one of them stepped closer to the boundary chain, the thin line that separated the sacred area from the public space. He leaned forward, holding his phone higher to get a better picture. Daniel's voice echoed sharply through the air. "Remain behind the chain, please." Every head in the crowd turned instantly. His tone wasn't angry, it was calm and professional, but it carried a firmness that could not be ignored. The young man froze for a second, then smiled awkwardly. His friend snickered, whispering something under his breath. Daniel resumed his march, keeping his focus straight ahead. The crowd was now completely silent. A few people looked uncomfortable. An older veteran standing near the front shook his head slowly. A child whispered to her mother, "Why are they laughing?" The woman only said softly, "Some people forget where they are." But the 2 men didn't seem embarrassed. Instead, they kept watching Daniel, whispering and smiling. One of them said something like, "He's not even allowed to talk to us," and took another step closer, pretending to trip over the chain. Daniel stopped mid-step and turned slightly. His voice, this time even firmer, echoed again, "Please remain behind the barrier." The authority in his tone finally made several people murmur. The young men looked uncertain now. They didn't mean real harm. They just didn't understand how serious this place was. Before Daniel could resume his walk, a pair of security guards from the visitor center began moving toward the commotion. One of them called out to the young men, asking them to step back. The crowd watched closely, hoping it would all calm down quickly. But then confusion followed. When the security guards reached the area, one of them misread the situation. He saw Daniel standing rigidly, rifle in hand, facing the 2 men who looked slightly nervous. The guard must have thought the soldier was being overly strict. He approached Daniel and asked something sharply, "What's going on here?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He wasn't supposed to break military form or speak casually while on duty. He remained silent, eyes forward, body straight. The second security guard spoke more loudly, saying, "Hey, I'm talking to you." Visitors looked uneasy now. A few people tried to explain, saying it wasn't him. Those 2 crossed the line. But the situation was already tangled in misunderstanding. Then, to make things worse, a nearby police officer who had been patrolling the area joined in, thinking something serious was happening. He stepped between Daniel and the crowd, asking the security guards what the problem was. The guard spoke quickly, trying to explain, but in the rush of words, the officer got the wrong idea. He looked at Daniel, the silent, expressionless guard with a rifle, and assumed he was being aggressive or uncooperative. Daniel stood perfectly still, not moving even a muscle. He knew he couldn't just start talking or explaining. His training told him that during confusion, his best action was calmness. Still, the officer didn't understand the rules of the tomb guard's duty. The police officer took a cautious step forward, saying, "Sir, I need you to step away." Daniel didn't respond. His focus was still on maintaining his posture. That silence made the officer believe he was refusing, and before anyone could properly explain, the misunderstanding reached its peak. The officer gently but firmly took hold of Daniel's arm, trying to move him aside. A second later, another officer helped, thinking the soldier was being difficult. Gasps filled the air. The tourists began speaking at once, trying to stop what was happening. "He didn't do anything wrong," shouted one man. "He's the guard. Those guys were the ones misbehaving." But in the rush, their words were lost. Daniel didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He didn't even change expression. His eyes stayed straight, his breathing calm. It was part of his training to stay composed no matter what. Still, inside, his heart felt heavy, not from anger, but from disbelief that the very people he protected didn't understand what his silence meant. The two young men who had started everything now looked shocked. Their smiles had vanished. They hadn't wanted this to happen. One of them whispered, "We didn't mean for that." But it was too late. The officers, thinking they were following procedure, stepped back and spoke into their radios. The crowd had gone completely quiet now. The air that had once felt peaceful now carried confusion and tension. A few moments later, one of the older guards from the administration office hurried over. He was pale and looked deeply uncomfortable. He spoke quickly to the officers, explaining who Daniel was and what his duty meant. The officers looked at each other, realizing the mistake too late. They immediately began to remove the cuffs they had placed on him. Daniel stood silently as they did, saying nothing, his expression unchanged. He didn't blame them. He simply waited. When the cuffs came off, one of the officers muttered an apology. Daniel gave a short nod, nothing more. Then he looked toward the tomb, straightened his shoulders, and said softly, "Permission to return to post, sir," to the relief commander who had arrived. The commander nodded firmly, and Daniel resumed his walk as if nothing had happened. His steps were calm and even, his face once again emotionless, his heart steady. The crowd watched in awe. What had begun as a small act of disrespect had turned into a lesson everyone would remember. The tourists who had misbehaved stood quietly now, shame written across their faces. One of them whispered, "We didn't understand." And as Daniel's boots clicked against the marble, echoing through the air, everyone present understood something new, that discipline, silence, and respect were stronger than words or confusion. The misunderstanding would soon reach the ears of someone much higher in rank, a man who would not take it lightly. Word of what happened near the tomb spread through the cemetery faster than anyone expected. Arlington was a place of quietness and respect, but that morning whispers carried from one guard to another. By the time Colonel James Porter heard about it, he was already on his way to the site. Colonel Porter was not a man easily shaken. He had served for more than 25 years and had seen both the beauty and the sorrow that came with duty. He believed in discipline, but more than that, he believed in honor. To him, the tomb of the unknown soldier wasn't just a monument. It was the heart of military respect. When his phone buzzed with a short message, "Incident near tomb, guard detained by mistake," he stopped mid-step. For a long second, he said nothing. Then he turned to his aide and said in a calm but heavy voice, "Get the car. We're going there now." The drive from headquarters to the cemetery was only a few minutes, but to the colonel it felt much longer. He looked out the window, watching the rows of white stones pass by, each one marking a story that ended too soon. His jaw tightened slightly. He didn't know the full details yet, but one thing he knew for sure. If a tomb guard had been cuffed while on duty, something had gone very wrong. When he arrived, the sky had grown brighter. The earlier mist had lifted, and sunlight spread across the marble, but the air still felt heavy. Near the tomb, a quiet crowd remained, unsure of what to do. The officers who had been involved stood to the side, looking uncomfortable. The tourists whispered softly, and at the center of it all stood Sergeant Daniel Hayes, back on duty, marching his line, calm as if nothing had happened. Colonel Porter stepped out of his car, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He wore his full uniform, his medals shining in the light. He didn't rush, but each step he took carried authority. People noticed. Conversation stopped. Even the air seemed to grow still. He approached the police officers first. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "Who touched my soldier?" he asked quietly. No one answered right away. The younger officer opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The colonel repeated just as softly, "I asked, who touched my soldier?" Finally, the older officer stepped forward and said, "Sir, there was a misunderstanding. We thought he was a misunderstanding." The colonel interrupted gently. You thought a guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier, standing on his post wearing his uniform carrying a ceremonial rifle, was what exactly? The officer looked down, not knowing what to say. The colonel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Do you realize where you are?" he asked. "Do you understand what this ground means?" The officers said nothing. Around them, the crowd listened in silence. The colonel turned to look at Daniel, who continued his steady march, never breaking rhythm. For a long moment, the colonel said nothing, simply watching the young guard move, each step precise, each turn perfect. Then he turned back to the officers. "That soldier," he said softly, "is honoring people who never came home. He stands here through rain, heat, and snow, not because someone orders him to, but because he chooses to. And today you put handcuffs on him for doing his duty." One of the officers tried to speak again. "Sir, we didn't realize—" "No," the colonel said, "you didn't. But you will now." He looked toward the crowd and raised his voice slightly, not in anger but in command. "Everyone here will remember what you saw today. You saw a man keep his composure while being treated unfairly. You saw a soldier who stood taller, even when others didn't understand his purpose." The people around them stood quietly. Some nodded, others looked ashamed. The two young men who had caused the problem were still standing off to the side. They hadn't left. Their faces were pale, their earlier smiles long gone. Colonel Porter walked over to them. They lowered their heads immediately, unable to meet his eyes. "Were you the ones who stepped past the barrier?" he asked calmly. The first young man stammered, "Yes, sir. We didn't mean any harm. We were just joking." The colonel nodded slowly. "Joking," he repeated. "Do you know what this place represents?" The young men shook their heads silently. He pointed to the marble tomb. "That stone covers men who never came home. Their families never saw their faces again. They don't even have names anymore. Every guard who stands here gives his time, his strength, and his silence to honor them. There is no joking here." Tears welled up in one of the young men's eyes. He whispered, "I'm sorry, sir." The colonel nodded. "Apology accepted. But understand this. Respect is not something you give only when it's easy. It's something you carry, especially in places like this." Then he turned to the police officers again. "You're not the enemy here," he said softly. "But you need to learn. These guards have rules, and those rules are sacred. They do not answer to anyone during their watch, not even me. Their silence is not disobedience. It's devotion." One of the officers nodded slowly, understanding now. "We're truly sorry, sir," he said quietly. The colonel looked at him for a moment, then said, "Then let's make this right." He called over the relief commander and spoke in a low voice. Moments later, a small, respectful announcement was made to the crowd. The relief commander explained what the tomb represented and why the guards act the way they do. The crowd listened with deep attention, many people nodding, some wiping their eyes. The colonel stood beside them, arms folded behind his back, watching. He wasn't looking for anyone to be embarrassed. He only wanted everyone present to understand the meaning of honor. When the explanation was over, he looked once more at Daniel. The guard had completed another turn and stopped briefly, his rifle held perfectly. Their eyes met for just a second. The colonel gave a small nod of pride, a silent thank you. Then he stepped closer and said quietly, "Sergeant, stand fast." Daniel paused in place, his boots perfectly aligned. "Son," the colonel continued softly, "you handled yourself with dignity. You didn't speak a word, but your silence spoke louder than any voice here. I'm proud of you." "Thank you, sir," Daniel said simply. The colonel straightened his posture and said firmly, "Resume your post." Daniel saluted sharply, turned with precision, and began his steady march once again. The click of his heels echoed across the marble like a heartbeat. The crowd stayed silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It felt as if the air itself stood still to honor the moment. Then, quietly, a few people began to clap, not loudly, not out of excitement, but softly, respectfully. It wasn't applause for entertainment, it was appreciation. Appreciation for discipline, for calmness, and for the kind of strength that doesn't need words. The colonel didn't stop them. He simply looked out over the rows of white stones and said softly to himself, "That's how a soldier teaches without speaking." Afterward, he walked over to the officers and spoke once more in a calm tone. "Learn from this. And the next time you see a man standing silent in uniform, remember that sometimes silence means duty, not defiance." The officers nodded deeply. They would remember that. Everyone who witnessed it would. As the sun climbed higher and the morning light brightened the marble, Daniel's steady steps continued. The same rhythm as before, unchanged, untouchable. Colonel Porter stayed for a few more minutes, standing quietly to watch. Then, with one last look at the tomb, he turned and walked away, his back straight, his face calm. He didn't need to say anything more. The lesson had already been taught, not by punishment, not by anger, but by the quiet dignity of a soldier who refused to let disrespect break his honor. After the incident, silence still hung in the air around the tomb of the unknown soldier. The crowd lingered quietly, some still staring toward the polished marble, others glancing at Sergeant Daniel Hayes as he resumed his slow, precise march. The officers stood to the side, speaking in low voices. The two young men who had crossed the boundary earlier stayed close together, their heads lowered, unsure of what to do. Colonel James Porter stepped forward once again. His boots made a soft sound on the pavement. He didn't rush. His presence alone seemed to draw everyone's attention. People instinctively stepped back, giving him space. His uniform was spotless, his medals gleaming in the sunlight. But there was no pride in his face, only seriousness and a deep sense of purpose. He looked around the crowd for a moment before speaking. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with authority. "This is not a moment to be angry," he began. "This is a moment to learn." The crowd hushed completely. Even the two young men who had caused the incident seemed to stop breathing for a second. "You are standing in one of the most sacred places in the world," the colonel continued. "Every step you take here carries meaning. Every sound you make is part of a larger silence that honors those who never came home." He paused, letting his words sink in. Many people in the crowd nodded slowly. Some held back tears. The air was filled with respect, even from those who had not understood before. The colonel walked slowly toward the young men. "Do you know why this place exists?" he asked them gently. They shook their heads. One of them mumbled softly, "We didn't know, sir." "Let me explain," the colonel said, his voice low but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This tomb holds the body of a soldier who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. We do not know his name. We do not know his story. But we know his sacrifice. That is why we guard him day and night without pause. It is not a performance. It is a promise." He turned toward the crowd. "Every soldier who stands here has chosen to bear that promise. It is not easy. We walk without speaking. We stand without moving. We face weather without complaint. That is our way of showing respect." The young men listened quietly. They looked at each other, then down at their feet. They no longer seemed amused. The colonel's eyes moved back to Daniel, who was still marching with perfect precision. His face showed no sign of what had happened earlier, but the colonel saw something deeper there, a strength of character that could only come from discipline and honor. "This man," the colonel said, pointing to Daniel, "did exactly what he was trained to do. He remained calm. He stayed silent. He honored his post even when treated unfairly." A soft murmur ran through the crowd. Many people shifted uncomfortably. Some realized they had not thought about the weight of what a tomb guard really carried. The colonel continued, "Respect is not given because someone says it should be given. Respect is earned and maintained, and once lost it can be hard to find again. The respect you owe here is not for me, not for the guard, and not even for the soldier in this tomb. It is for every soldier who sacrificed their life for something greater than themselves." The two young men now looked ashamed. One of them spoke quietly. "We didn't know, sir. We thought it was just a ceremony." The colonel nodded slowly. "It is a ceremony, but it is a ceremony of devotion. It is not about showing off or creating a spectacle. It is about teaching us to remember, to honor, and to carry forward the memory of those who gave their lives so we could have peace." He turned again to the crowd. "This is why the tomb guard never breaks form. This is why we do not speak while on duty. The silence you see is respect made visible. It is discipline made into action, and it is a lesson for all of us." The crowd listened quietly. A few people wiped their eyes. Some shifted their stance as though absorbing a truth they had never considered before. Colonel Porter spoke directly to the young men again. "You have learned something today, whether you realize it or not. You have learned that honor is not something we talk about. It is something we live. You have learned that actions speak louder than words, and most of all you have learned that every place of respect deserves to be treated with humility. One of the young men whispered, "We're sorry, sir." The colonel nodded once more. Apologies are important. But what matters more is what you carry from this moment forward. He stepped away slightly and gestured toward Daniel. Sergeant Hayes has shown you how to stand when tested. He has shown you what it means to serve with honor. Let that be your lesson today. The silence that followed was deep. Even the wind seemed to hush itself as though listening. For a moment, no one moved. Then a woman in the crowd quietly said, "Thank you for teaching us that." The colonel glanced at her briefly, then said, "It is not I who teaches. It is the soldiers themselves. They do not seek recognition. They seek only to honor those who cannot speak for themselves." He turned back to Daniel. "Sergeant, you may continue your post." Daniel saluted and without hesitation resumed his steady march. The crowd watched, some with heads bowed, others with eyes fixed in admiration. The sound of his boots clicking against the marble became a quiet echo that filled the hearts of those standing nearby. The colonel stayed for a few more minutes, watching. He did not speak again. His presence was enough to make people feel the weight of what had happened. Eventually, he stepped away and addressed the officers. This was more than a mistake. It was a chance to teach everyone here what respect really means. Do not forget it. The officers nodded deeply, understanding that this was more than a matter of procedure. It was a matter of principle. The two young men lingered quietly for a while. One of them finally said softly, "We will remember this." The colonel looked at them for a moment, then simply nodded. Good. As he turned to leave, he looked back at Daniel once more. The young guard was still marching, still disciplined, still silent. The colonel knew that the lesson Daniel had given without words was far more powerful than anything he could say. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but a quiet energy remained. People spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen. They talked about honor, respect, and discipline. They talked about the soldier who had been cuffed, and the colonel who had turned a moment of misunderstanding into a lesson for everyone present. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood in silence, unchanging, watching over it all. And for those who had witnessed that day, it had become something more than a memorial. It had become a reminder that honor is not earned in loud words or applause, but in quiet action and deep respect. Colonel Porter left the site with his head held high, knowing that he had done more than resolve an incident. He had reminded a crowd of something they would not forget. And Sergeant Hayes continued to stand his post, walking his line with perfect steps, embodying the lesson in honor that the colonel had spoken of. The days after the incident at the tomb of the unknown soldier felt different for many who had been there that morning. For the visitors, for the soldiers, and even for the cemetery itself, something had shifted. It was not something loud or obvious, but a quiet understanding that had settled into hearts. News of what had happened spread quietly at first. Visitors who had been there told others. Soldiers spoke of it among themselves. Soon it reached more ears, including those of people far from Arlington. The story appeared in a local newspaper not as a scandal, but as a reminder of respect, discipline, and humility. The headline read simply, "Tomb Guard mistakenly detained, restores duty with dignity." For Sergeant Daniel Hayes, the story was not about headlines or attention. He did not speak to reporters. He did not seek recognition. His duty was not to himself but to the soldier in the tomb, to the memory of those who could no longer speak for themselves. Each day, he returned to his post with the same quiet determination. Rain, wind, sun, or snow, it made no difference. His boots clicked softly against the marble. 21 steps forward, 21 seconds still, 21 steps back. The rhythm was the same. The lesson was the same. But now Daniel felt a deeper sense of purpose. That moment of misunderstanding, followed by the colonel's words, had changed something inside him. It was no longer just about guarding the tomb. It was about carrying forward a lesson for others. Visitors continued to come. Families, veterans, tourists from faraway places. Some came knowing the story, having read about it or heard it from friends. They came quietly with a different kind of attention, as if they understood something new before even stepping inside the cemetery. The two young men who had caused the incident that morning never returned to the tomb, but they carried the lesson with them. One of them later wrote in his personal journal about the day he had learned the meaning of respect. He wrote about the silence, about the colonel's words, and about the guard who had stood without complaint. For him, that day became a turning point. Colonel Porter also continued his work quietly without making a public announcement. For him, the lesson was not about praise. It was about ensuring that respect was never forgotten. He spoke of the incident privately to fellow officers, not to criticize but to remind them of their own duty to teach respect wherever it was needed. Among the soldiers of the honor guard, the story became something like a quiet legend. They spoke of it not as an incident but as a lesson in discipline, humility, and honor. Sergeant Hayes became a silent example for them. They didn't speak loudly of what happened. They simply carried it in their own practice of duty. For the visitors, too, the story lingered in their minds. Many who had been there that morning returned again. Some just to stand in quiet respect, some to watch the guard and remember what they had learned. It was no longer just a ceremony they observed. It was a lesson they carried with them. One afternoon, weeks later, a mother came with her small daughter. The little girl watched Daniel walk his line quietly for a long time. She whispered to her mother, "Why doesn't he talk?" The mother bent down and said softly, "Because he is speaking with his actions." "That silence is a promise," the little girl nodded slowly. She stepped forward, making sure she stayed behind the chain, and saluted. Daniel acknowledged her with the smallest nod of his head before continuing his march. That moment, simple as it was, carried more meaning than words could hold. That small exchange became something Daniel remembered. He had stood for years guarding the tomb, but moments like this reminded him why he did it. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the quiet truth of honor. Weeks turned into months. The story of the mistaken arrest became part of Arlington's living memory. Soldiers would tell the story to new recruits. Visitors would speak of it quietly to others. It became not just an event but a lesson, a reminder that respect is not something that can be demanded. It must be lived. For Colonel Porter, the lesson remained clear and simple. Respect is not given automatically. It must be shown. And once shown, it must be maintained. He often thought about that morning when he saw a guard cuffed in error. To him, it was a sign that even in places of discipline and honor, misunderstandings could happen. But how those moments were handled could make all the difference. One evening, as the sun set over Arlington, the colonel stood silently near the tomb. Daniel was still marching, his steps steady even as the light dimmed. The colonel watched him for a long time. In the silence, he thought about the words he had spoken earlier, the words about honor, discipline, and respect. They were not just words. They were a promise he knew every soldier in his regiment carried with them. For Daniel, every day at the tomb was both the same and different. The steps, the turns, the stillness, these remained unchanged. But now each step carried the weight of the lesson taught by the colonel. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been there that day. Sometimes visitors would approach quietly after his shift to thank him. They didn't need to speak loudly. A quiet nod, a soft smile, a brief word of gratitude, it was enough. Daniel would simply nod in return and continue his work. That was his way of teaching. That was his way of honoring the unknown soldier. The tomb itself seemed to stand taller somehow after that incident. It did not speak. It never changed. But those who stood before it left carrying a piece of its lesson. They carried the understanding that respect is not just an idea, it is action. That honor is not just a word, it is lived every day. Months later, a small article appeared in a national magazine. It told the story simply. A tomb guard was cuffed in error and a colonel corrected the mistake. Not with anger, but with words of deep respect. The article didn't make loud headlines, but among those who read it, it sparked thought. It reminded people that honor is something we all owe to those who came before us. For Daniel Hayes, Colonel Porter, and every soldier who stood at the tomb, that story was not just a headline, it was a reminder of their mission. Their duty was not to themselves, but to something far greater, to keep the promise of honor alive. And so, every day, Daniel returned to his post. He marched 21 steps forward, stopped, turned, held still for 21 seconds, turned again, and stepped back. Over and over again, no matter the weather, no matter the noise, no matter the misunderstanding or mistake. For him, that rhythm was more than a routine. It was a vow to keep the memory of the unknown soldier alive. And with each step he spoke without words, teaching anyone who would listen that respect is not demanded, it is shown, and honor is something we live with every day. In the quiet of Arlington National Cemetery, the tomb stood, silent, still, watching, and those who had been there that day carried its lesson with them forever.